Hey everyone, Numedia here. So with Burning Crusade around the horizon, I wanted to talk about the raiding encounters that TBC brought and specifically go over the most infamous and challenging ones players had to face back in the day. Vanilla/classic WoW raiding brought some awesome raiding encounters that players had a blast re-experiencing. But with TBC, Blizzard saw the opportunity of raiding and how players were always looking forward to clearing more and more raiding content as a cohesive group. And they doubled down on that for TBC. No longer would you have to fight bosses that had just a couple abilities at most. Now, bosses would be way more complex and challenging. And with raid sizes being shrunk down from 40 to 25 players, it meant that everyone had to perform to the best of their ability. No longer could you rely on a couple people to outperform that 40th slacker in your raid and go away with it. Encounters were designed for active 25 players in mind, and the stories I'm gonna tell you about today all but prove that. So in no particular order, let's go over 6 of the hardest raid bosses that tore guilds apart in TBC. Number 1. Kelthas. So when you think of tough raid bosses, this is the first one that comes to mind. Kelthas was for the longest time the hardest boss that guilds ever had to face in World of Warcraft. He went through so many nerfs before getting killed that the next raid, Black Temple, was released 10 days without anyone being able to zone in because no one could down Kelthas. Kelthas was a complex 5-phase fight that required an excellent coordination, perfect healing, tanking and DPS, and also a bit of luck involved. The fight would start with you fighting each one of the 4 advisors of Kelthas, one after the other. Those mini-bosses were tough by themselves. Then after you managed to kill all of them, their weapons would get to life, and now you had to fight all their weapons at once. After you killed their weapons, they would drop a legendary item which is basically each weapon you were fighting, and those were necessary to deal with some mechanics later on. So you would have to assign a weapon to a specific player of your raid, mainly tanks, to deal with those mechanics later. And then, after you managed to do that, Kelthas would now resurrect all of his advisors at once, which were a pain in the butt to fight individually. And now you have to fight all of them at once and deal with all their mechanics simultaneously. You had to kill all 4 of them fast enough. If you had more than 1 or 2 advisors overlapping the next phase, it pretty much meant a wipe. So that was a DPS check by itself. And then, during the next phase, you could finally fight Kael'Thas himself, who had multiple abilities that could easily wipe your raid if not dealt with correctly. This fight was just a classical, increasingly more chaotic fight that could overwhelm you if you just messed up one aspect of it. And the worst part about it is that during its first iteration, Kael'Thas was not only way too overtuned, but also super buggy. And that's the reason why it required so many nerfs for Nihilum to get him down. But even after he was killed by Nihilum, no one could kill him after that, so Blizzard had to nerf him even more. Number 2. Archimonde. Archimonde is the last boss of Mount Hyjal, and as far as bosses that would punish you for one misstep, this one took the crown. Archimonde was a simple one-phase fight that had 4 main abilities to deal with, but where the difficulty of this fight lied was a combination of not being able to do anything half of the fight, and if one death occurs, it would lead to a trickle-down effect where more and more players are gonna die until your whole raid is wiped. And on top of all of that, Archimonde has an enrage timer that would just wipe everyone instantly with his iconic Hand of Death ability. So the reason I was saying you couldn't do anything on this fight for most of the time is because of 3 abilities. 1. Airburst, which is a knockaway effect that would toss everyone around in a certain area in the air, leaving you unable to cast any spells or do any melee attacks for the duration that you're airborne. And number 2, Doomfire, which is a huge patch of fire that would follow a random person in the raid and sporadically switch to another player randomly. And then, on top of all of that, Archimonde also periodically fears everyone in your raid for 8 seconds. So with all of that combined, you can clearly see how frustrating this fight can be. You're basically not in control of your character from either being knocked in the air, feared, or fleeing from the Doomfire. Combine that with the fact that Archimonde hits your tank like a truck, You can clearly see how small real estate your healers have to heal, and they need to be completely focused on keeping either themselves alive or the tanks. If anyone messed up and ends up walking or being unlucky by being feared in a Doomfire, they're pretty much gonna die. And if anyone dies, Archimonde gains a buff called Soul Charge, which basically means that more and more players are gonna die after this, leading to more soul charges and more deaths. So this fight is just a survival fight where you're just incapacitated for most of the time, coupled with a race to getting him down before he enrages. So you can see why so many guilds had a tough time on Archimonde. Number 3. Lady Vashj. Lady Vashj is one of those fights that went through multiple nerfs before guilds could finally down it. It's a simple 3-phase encounter where you fight Vashj herself with all her different abilities, then fight mobs that come in waves, and loot an item from them that lets you enable generators around the room to transition into phase 3. And then, once you do that, phase 3 is basically the same as phase 1, but with one specific nuance added to it. You now have spores that deal a ton of AoE nature damage and spawn faster and faster the longer it takes for you to finish her in phase 3. So it's basically a race to getting her down as soon as possible, otherwise it's back to square one. As I said, this fight went through many different iterations, both nerfing her values down, but also nerfing how mechanics work, and fixing many bugs along the way that made her unkillable. The footage you're seeing here on screen is Method, which managed to do the world's second kill on Vash back in 2007, in patch 2.0. And let's see what buffs they were using. Oh, is that world buffs? Yeah, world buffs were still a thing from patch 2.0 to patch 2.1. And as you can see, guilds were using them to get many bosses down. That deserves a video on its own, and I'll probably make one in the future to talk about this issue. Number 4. Muru. Muru is probably the most popular boss for being an absolute roadblock in TBC. SK Gaming was the first guild to down this boss back in 2008. And in order to do that, they had to basically bring 20 plus players with leatherworking to rotate drums of battle. And they also had to bring 5 shamans, one for each group, to do bloodlust for the whole raid to even have a chance to down this boss. This was the extent to what players had to go back in 2008 to get the final blow on Muru. That, coupled with the fact that this boss was very overtuned, he was also a boss that got nerfed multiple times before any reasonable number of guilds could down him. Muru is a simple 2-phase fight, where you first fight Muru himself and a bunch of ad waves that spawn throughout phase 1, and then you have to fight Entropius, who deals an incredibly large amount of shadow AoE damage throughout phase 2. The difficulty of this fight resides in the fact that not only would the waves of ads spawn way too quick for anyone who wasn't using those crazy methods to be able to kill them before getting overwhelmed, let alone being able to damage Muru himself, but also because you had to have a completely perfect transition into phase 2 to even stand any chance to be able to kill Entropius fast enough. This boss is considered by many the number 1 hardest boss in the history of World of Warcraft, and rightfully so. Number 5. Brutallus. While we're in Sunwell Plateau, let's talk about Brutallus, the definition of a gear check. Brutallus was the second boss of Sunwell Plateau, and he was basically a patchwork on steroids, but with more abilities. For one, he dealt a ridiculous amount of DPS to your tank. Anyone who wasn't wearing full tier 6 gear would get clapped in one hit. And then, as you were fighting Brutallus, you had to think mainly about 2 things. One, his 6 minutes enrage timer, which by the way was way faster than any guilds could pump at the time. And 2, his meteor slash ability, which was both the tank swap ability and the group soaking mechanic. So you had to split your raid in 2 groups, each group taking turns in soaking 3 meteor slash stacks, and then swapping with the other group. And by then, melees were becoming extremely powerful at the start of patch 2.4, thanks to both having Warglaives from Illidan and the Elixir of Demon Slaying. Rogues and Fury Warriors were among the best DPS classes to bring for this fight. But to take advantage of their DPS, they needed to be behind the boss at all times, meaning that they couldn't soak the Meteor Slash. So bring too many melees and you couldn't survive the Meteor Slash. Bring too little and you couldn't bring Brutallus down fast enough. It was an extremely hard endeavor for many guilds, because very little melees by then were geared enough to be able to do enough damage to Brutallus, let alone having 2 Warglaives. And since melee sucked on the damage meters for the majority of the expansion, many guilds straight up didn't have any. So many guilds got stuck on this gear check of a fight for months. Similarly to how many guilds got stuck on 4 horsemen because they just didn't have 8 tanks at their disposal. And I wanted to include this boss to talk about this one point that I think many players are completely ignoring for TBC. You get a ton of players saying that melees just suck in TBC, and they just don't bring anything to the raids, so everyone who's playing a warrior or a rogue right now in Classic is already thinking about switching to another class. But I want you to reconsider that for a second, because warriors and rogues will become extremely valuable classes once they manage to get their hands on some tier 6 gear or a set of warglaives. Couple that with the elixir of demon slaying, and you will become a killing machine. And any guilds that are smart enough will want to have a few trustworthy rogues and warriors early on and gear them for Black Temple and Sunwell. So I would consider that if you're thinking about completely abandoning your warrior or rogue for TBC. Number 6. Illidari Council. So Black Temple was cleared in less than 2 weeks by Nihilum in TBC. This raid was not exactly the most challenging raid Blizzard ever offered. In fact, it was probably the easiest raid in TBC all along. But Black Temple had a few memorable and challenging bosses to offer. The most challenging one probably being the Illidari Council. This fight is a 4 mini-boss fight which had their health pools linked. You had Lady Vashj, Zerevor, Gathios, and Veras. Each boss required a designated tank, and you even had to have a mage tank for Zerevor. Each of those bosses had their own long list of abilities to worry about. I'm not gonna go over each one of them, but the gist of this fight is basically to manage to nail the pole to avoid having this fight go out of hand quickly, and then to have a perfect interrupt rotation on Lady Vashj so that she doesn't heal every boss. This boss is not the hardest one, but because there's so many things that players need to manage all at once, guilds back then would easily get overwhelmed, and it's not uncommon to have guilds one-shotting every other boss in Black Temple and then getting stuck on this fight for a week or 2. Now, the big question is, since so many players are mowing through the raiding content in Classic currently, do you think TBC raiding will be as challenging as it was back in the day? Do you think Blizzard should bring those iconic bosses on their first iteration, pre-nerf, or do you think it doesn't really matter, and they should just give us the game how it was on the last patch and let us play it like that? Now is your time. Give your thoughts in the comments below, and maybe someone from Blizzard sees this video, so take advantage of that. That's all I got. I hope this trip down memory lane helped you guys remember some of those tough fights we had to overcome back in TBC. And if you never played TBC, I hope this will be helpful for you in the future. If you guys think I missed a boss on this list, or if there's a boss that I mentioned that your guild stomped through back in TBC, let me know in the comments. I'm curious to hear your experience with these encounters. With that said, remember to have fun, take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Bye for now.